Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months, my mother yelled, her voice ringing through the hospital room. I sat there stunned, holding my phone with trembling hands. It was Christmas Eve at Las Vegas Medical Center, just me, my 2-year-old twins, Ethan and Emily, quietly playing in the corner, and Nurse Valerie checking my vitals. The pain in my abdomen was unbearable, like a knife being twisted inside me, but what hurt even more was the look of indifference on my mother's face through the video call. I'm Natasha Wilson, 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've always been the afterthought in my own family. My younger sister Jessica was the golden child, never doing anything wrong in my parents' eyes. Meanwhile, I couldn't even get them to watch their only grandchildren while I underwent emergency surgery for complications after my husband's death 6 months ago. The doctors had found internal bleeding that needed immediate attention, but all my parents cared about was their concert and spending Christmas Eve with Jessica. When I finally asked for their help, after exhausting every other option, my dad's response cut deeper than any scalpel could. "You're becoming a real nuisance and burden, Natasha. We're retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems." For 3 years, I'd been financially supporting my parents, sending them $2,500 every month to help with their mortgage and expenses. Even after James passed, I continued helping them out of love and a sense of duty, believing family should always be there for each other. How foolish I'd been. As tears quietly fell onto the hospital blanket, Valerie gently squeezed my shoulder. "My friend Olivia is a professional nanny who specializes in childhood trauma. Let me call her for you," she said, her voice full of kindness, a stark contrast to my parents' callousness. The twins were still too young to understand what was happening. They'd already lost their father to a car accident, and now they might lose me too if the surgery didn't go well. The thought terrified me, but not nearly as much as the idea of leaving them with people who saw them as burdens. In that moment, amid the pain in my body and the crushing disappointment in my heart, I made my decision. "Yes, please call her," I told Valerie. And with those words, I began severing the toxic ties to the people who had raised me, but never truly loved me. As I hung up the phone, a flood of memories washed over me. My childhood had been filled with moments of being overlooked while Jessica received all the attention. When I graduated college with honours, my parents barely acknowledged it because Jessica had landed a role in a local commercial that same weekend. When I married James, they complained about the wedding venue being too far from their home. Even when the twins were born, they visited only once, claiming the babies were too fussy for their liking. James had always been my rock, understanding the pain of family disappointment because he'd been estranged from his own father for years. "We'll build our own family," he'd say, "one that knows how to love." And we did. We created a warm home filled with laughter and acceptance. But 6 months ago, a drunk driver took him away, leaving me to raise our children alone while battling grief and depression. Despite everything I had been through, I continued supporting my parents, even increasing the monthly amount when they mentioned struggling with inflation. I wanted to be better than them, to prove that family should always stand by each other, no matter what. The irony hit me hard. Here I was in a hospital bed, bleeding internally, possibly dying, and they couldn't miss one concert to care for my children. Valerie returned with good news. Her friend Olivia, a professional nanny, would be arriving within the hour. "She's great with kids," Valerie assured me. "She used to work with trauma victims at the Children's Hospital before becoming a private nanny." "How much will this cost?" I asked, anxiety creeping in. My medical bills were already adding up, and James's insurance had its limits. "Don't worry about that now," Valerie said, her voice soothing. "Let's focus on getting you ready for surgery." But I was worried. I thought about the $2,500 I was scheduled to transfer to my parents next week. The money that could now go toward paying for childcare instead. That thought ignited something in me. a spark of self-preservation that had been extinguished for years. When Olivia arrived, she was everything Valerie had promised: kind, professional, and immediately connecting with the twins. As the hospital staff prepared me for surgery, I made a decision. "Could you bring me my phone one more time?" I asked Valerie, my hands trembling. With shaking fingers, I sent 2 messages. The first was to my bank, cancelling all future automatic transfers to my parents' account. The second was to my parents. "I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Don't contact me again." As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I felt something unexpected. Through the pain and fear, I felt freedom. The surgery was successful, though it left me weaker than anticipated. I spent 5 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, grateful for Olivia, who went above and beyond by staying with the twins in my room during the day and taking them to my apartment at night. During one of my more lucid moments, I noticed my phone blinking with notifications. 27 missed calls and numerous text messages from my parents and Jessica. Most of the messages followed a familiar pattern: confusion, anger, then desperate pleas about their mortgage payment. Not once did they ask how my surgery went or if the twins were okay. The final message from my dad was particularly telling. "You can't just cut us off like this. We've planned a cruise next month, and the tickets are non-refundable." My sister's messages were different. She seemed genuinely confused. "Mum and Dad just told me you were having some minor procedure. What's going on? Why are they freaking out about money?" It hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents had lied to Jessica about the severity of my surgery, likely to justify their choice of a concert over caring for their grandchildren. I decided to tell her the truth. Groggy from the medication, I sent her the full story. Her response came quickly. "Oh my God, Natasha, I had no idea it was an emergency surgery. They told me you were just being dramatic about a routine checkup." I would have watched the twins if I'd known. I had to admit I'd been wrong to believe that Jessica was cruel. She had simply grown up in an environment where her needs were always prioritized, and perhaps this revelation would help her finally see our parents for who they truly were. By the time I was discharged, I had already made a few important decisions. First, I hired Olivia part-time to help with the twins while I focused on my recovery. Second, I contacted a lawyer to draft a will, naming a trusted friend as the twins' guardian should anything happen to me, not our parents. Third, I blocked my parents' numbers, leaving only limited contact open with Jessica, as I took time to assess her sincerity. The financial impact of these choices was significant. The $2,500 monthly payment I'd been sending to my parents was a huge portion of my income, about a third. Yet without it, I could finally afford better childcare and maybe even start rebuilding the emergency fund that had been wiped out after James's death. That night, as I lay in bed, the twins sleeping soundly in their room across the hall, I felt a swirl of emotions. There was guilt, still that ingrained belief that I was somehow wrong for putting myself and my children first. There was fear, too, about managing my recovery while caring for 2 toddlers. But amid it all, there was an unfamiliar sense of self-respect starting to grow. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jessica. "I just had a huge fight with Mom and Dad about how they treated you. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Can we talk tomorrow?" Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. 2 weeks into my recovery, I was slowly regaining my strength. The incisions still throbbed when I moved too quickly, but day by day it was getting better. Olivia continued to be a blessing, arriving every morning to help with the twins while I worked from home. Thankfully, my graphic design clients were understanding of my limited availability, and I was grateful for the remote work that allowed me to stay close to my children. Jessica had visited twice, bringing healthy meals and spending time with the twins. Our conversations were careful at first, but little by little, She began to open up about her own experiences with our parents. "They always made it seem like you were the one pushing us away," she admitted one evening as we watched the twins play. "I never realized they were the ones pushing you out." I was beginning to see a different side of my sister, a side that had been hidden for years beneath our parents' manipulation. While I wasn't ready to fully trust her yet, I appreciated the effort she was putting into understanding my perspective. Then, one evening, the knock I had been half expecting came. Through the peephole, I saw my parents standing in the hallway. My mother was holding her designer purse, her usual anxious expression in place, while my father stood with his arms crossed, his impatience written all over his face. I hesitated, my heart racing, before opening the door just enough to speak through the gap. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "Natasha, darling, we've been so worried," my mother began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, immediately putting me on guard. "You haven't been answering our calls, and we just wanted to make sure you and the twins were okay." "We're fine," I answered flatly. "Now, if that's all—" "It's not all," my father interrupted, pushing slightly against the door. "We need to talk about this ridiculous financial situation," my father started, his tone sharp. "The bank called about our mortgage, and we had to dip into our cruise savings to cover it. The audacity is breathtaking. No questions about my recovery, no concern for their grandchildren, just demands for money." "I told you I'm cutting financial ties," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I meant it." "But sweetie," my mother interjected, her voice rising in desperation, "we've come to rely on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us." "Commitment?" I echoed, my disbelief growing. "I've been sending money out of guilt and obligation, while you couldn't even watch your grandchildren during my emergency surgery." My father's face darkened. "That's not fair, Natasha." "Fair?" I scoffed. "You had plans. Plans more important than my children's safety. More important than my life." Anger began to build inside me. "Do you know what the doctor said? There was a chance I might not survive that surgery. Did you even ask how I was doing afterward?" Their silence spoke volumes. "We made one mistake," my mother whispered dramatically, her voice cracking. "Are you really going to punish us like this?" "This isn't punishment, Mom," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "This is consequence. I spent my whole life seeking your approval and support, and when I needed you most, you chose Elton John tickets over helping me." "We're your parents," my father barked, his voice suddenly demanding respect. "And I'm a parent too," I countered. "I would never treat Ethan and Emily the way you've treated me." At that moment, Emily toddled into the room, clutching her stuffed giraffe. My mother immediately switched gears. "There's my precious grandbaby," she cooed, bending down to offer a smile. "Grandma brought presents." Emily, unsure of these strangers, hesitated, and then looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll reach out, but the money, it's no longer your concern." I gently closed the door behind me. The next morning, my parents showed up with reinforcements. Aunt Patty, my mother's sister, who always positioned herself as the family peacemaker. "Natasha, honey, let's be reasonable," Aunt Patty pleaded from outside the door, which I hadn't opened. "Your parents are struggling without your help." "They managed their finances for decades before I started helping them," I responded calmly through the door. "They chose early retirement knowing their savings weren't adequate." My mother's voice cracked through the door. "We made those decisions because you promised to help us. We've had to cancel our cruise, and now we might lose the house." Their attempts at manipulation felt so transparent now. The fog of guilt that had clouded my judgment for years was finally gone. When had I ever promised lifetime support? I had only offered temporary help after their retirement, but somehow they had turned that into an expectation. "Mom, Dad, I'm recovering from major surgery and taking care of 2 toddlers. This conversation is over," I said firmly before walking away from the door, ignoring their continued knocking and pleading. Later that day, I received a group email from my father, addressed to the entire extended family. The email from my father painted a picture of me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned them when they needed me most, after they had sacrificed everything for me. They conveniently left out the fact that they had refused to help with the twins during my emergency surgery. Instead, they portrayed me as someone who suddenly cut them off without reason. What they didn't anticipate was the backlash. My cousin Michael, who lived near my parents, was quick to reply to the group asking, "Uncle Robert, didn't you just buy a new boat last month? And Aunt Diana, wasn't that a new diamond tennis bracelet you were showing off at Thanksgiving?" Other family members chimed in, many of them privately messaging me to get the full story. Even Aunt Patty called me directly after learning the truth. "I had no idea about your surgery," she admitted. "They told me you were just being dramatic about some routine procedure and using it to punish them financially." Meanwhile, Jessica, who had witnessed our parents' behavior firsthand, took my side completely. She helped me craft a clear, factual response to the family email thread. "I recently underwent emergency surgery with significant risks of complications. My parents refused to watch my children during this time because they had concert tickets. I am now focusing on my recovery and caring for my twins without additional stress." The support that followed was overwhelming. Michael's wife brought over home-cooked meals, and a second cousin whom I barely knew offered her services as a part-time babysitter at no charge. Jessica started spending weekends with me, helping me take care of Ethan and Emily while I recovered. Surprisingly, Valerie, a nurse from the hospital, connected me with a support group for young widowed parents. Their first meeting was via Zoom, allowing me to participate from home. For the first time since James passed, I felt truly understood by people who had walked a similar path. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation began to unravel. It turned out that they had been living far beyond their means, relying on my monthly contributions to support their travel and luxury purchases. Jessica discovered that they had taken out a second mortgage on their house a year earlier to buy the boat, assuming I would continue to subsidize their primary mortgage indefinitely. "They've been lying to everyone," Jessica said, shocked after reviewing their finances at their request. "They're not destitute, they're just overspent. They'd be fine if they sold the boat and timeshare." Their increasingly desperate voicemails and texts kept coming, but with each passing day, their hold on me grew weaker. From the ashes of their betrayal, I was building something new, a support network based on mutual care rather than obligation. A month after my surgery, a major unexpected twist came. My parents received a foreclosure notice. Jessica called me, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. "They're in complete panic mode," she explained. "The bank is giving them 60 days to catch up on payments or they'll lose the house." I frowned, bouncing Emily on my knee while Ethan napped. "What about their retirement funds?" "Mostly depleted," Jessica sighed. "They spent a chunk on that boat and invested the rest in some scheme Dad's golf buddy recommended. They lost almost everything." "I'm not saying you should help them, Natasha," Jessica said gently. "I just thought you should know." Later that evening, I received desperate texts from both of my parents, now abandoning all pretense of concern for my well-being and outright begging for money. My mother's message was especially telling. "We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We just assumed you were angry and would start sending money again after a week or two." Their assumption that my boundaries weren't real infuriated me. All those years of putting their needs before mine, of accepting their mistreatment, had amounted to nothing. They had never truly respected me at all. Meanwhile, my life was taking unexpected turns. The support group I'd joined had become a lifeline, connecting me with other parents navigating similar struggles. Through them, I met Diana, a real estate agent whose husband had died of cancer 2 years earlier, leaving her with a 3-year-old son. Diana helped me consider options I hadn't thought possible, like selling my too small apartment and using the equity to move to a more affordable neighbourhood with better childcare options. I'd also started a small side business designing memorial websites, inspired by the one I had created for James. Several members of the support group had hired me for their own projects, and word was beginning to spread. For the first time since becoming a widow, I felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The contrast between my personal growth and my parents' rapid decline became even more evident when they showed up unannounced at my apartment again, this time with a detailed spreadsheet of their debts. "We need $144,000 to catch up on the mortgage and avoid foreclosure," my father said, his usual authoritative tone now tinged with desperation. I invited them in, not out of obligation, but because I was genuinely curious to hear their perspective now that they were truly facing the consequences of their actions. "What about selling the boat?" I asked, motioning for them to sit at my small dining table. "We'd take a loss," my father protested. "And the timeshare?" I pressed. "We've tried," my mother quickly added, "but the market is terrible. Besides, those are our retirement luxuries." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Luxuries you can't afford. "We could afford them with your help," my father countered, his tone hardening. "It's the least you could do after everything we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me?" I asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. The twins chose that moment to toddle into the room, Ethan clutching his favourite truck and Emily babbling happily. My parents' expressions softened instantly. "There are our precious babies," my mother cooed, reaching for Emily, who promptly hid behind my legs. "They don't know you," I said simply. "You've seen them, what, 3 times in their lives? You chose not to be involved." "That's not fair," my father protested. "Too busy to help your only grandchildren, too busy to help your daughter through an emergency surgery," I observed, my voice calm. "But not too busy to ask for money. I think that says everything about your priorities." My mother's face crumpled, but whether it was from genuine emotion or calculated manipulation, I couldn't tell anymore. "Without your help, we'll lose everything," she whispered. "I lost my husband," I replied, my voice steady, "and I'm still standing." "My children lost their father. We survived. You'll survive too," I said, my voice steady, but the weight of those words settled heavily in my chest. 3 months after my surgery, my parents faced the inevitable. They had no choice but to sell their house to avoid foreclosure. Jessica kept me updated on their situation, although I kept my distance. They had managed to find a modest condo, significantly downsizing from their once lavish 4,000 square foot lakefront property. My father had reluctantly sold his boat at a loss, and they'd finally unloaded the timeshare for a fraction of what they had paid. "They're actually blaming you for their financial problems in front of everyone," Jessica told me during one of her weekly visits. "It's bizarre to watch. They tell anyone who will listen that you abandoned them after promising lifelong support." "Let them talk," I replied, surprisingly unbothered. "The truth speaks for itself." And it did. My extended family had largely rallied around me after learning the full story, even my father's sister, who had always been on his side in family disputes. She called to express her support after hearing about their refusal to help during my surgery. Meanwhile, my own life had improved dramatically. Diana from my support group had helped me find and purchase a small 3-bedroom house in a family-friendly neighbourhood. The mortgage payments were even less than my apartment rent had been, and the twins finally had a backyard to play in for the first time in their lives. My side business designing memorial websites had grown enough that I could cut back on my graphic design clients, focusing more on work that felt meaningful. Olivia still helped with childcare 3 days a week, but I'd adjusted my schedule to maximize time with Ethan and Emily. Most importantly, I had found a community. Neighbours brought casseroles when we moved in, and the support group organised playdates. Jessica had become a genuine sister rather than a competitor for our parents' affection. Even Valerie from the hospital occasionally stopped by with her children. I had lost my husband, cut ties with my parents, but somehow I felt less alone than ever before. Then, 6 months after my surgery, I received a letter. A real, handwritten letter from my mother. I almost tossed it in the trash unopened, but curiosity won out. Inside was something I'd never expected, a real apology. "I've had time to reflect on my behaviour," she wrote. "Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to confront some painful truths about myself as a mother. I was jealous of your independence and resilience. I resented that you didn't seem to need me the way I needed my own mother. But now I see that you did need me. Just not in the ways I wanted to be needed. When you asked us to care for the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out, and we failed you completely. I'm deeply sorry." The letter continued to explain how they had restructured their finances. My father had taken a part-time job at a local hardware store, and they had sold most of their luxury items, now living more modestly than they had in decades. There was no ask for money or forgiveness, just an acknowledgement of her apology. I showed it to Jessica, who was skeptical. "They've been talking about writing to you for weeks. Dad was against it at first, but I think he's starting to see things differently, especially after his heart scare last month." "Heart scare?" I asked, concerned despite myself. "Just high blood pressure and chest pains, but it scared him. He's on medication now and actually following the doctor's orders," Jessica explained. "I think facing his mortality has humbled him a bit." I wasn't ready to respond right away. I needed time to process. Was this true remorse? Or was it just another manipulation tactic? Had they genuinely changed, or were they adapting their strategy? That night, I went through old family photos for the first time since cutting ties. Behind the smiles, I saw patterns I had been blind to for years. My parents had always been performers, playing the part of the perfect parents while serving their own needs first. A year after my surgery, I agreed to meet them at a neutral spot, a quiet cafe near my new home. When they arrived, they were almost unrecognizable. My father seemed smaller, his confident posture replaced by a humbler demeanor. My mother had swapped her designer clothes for simple, practical attire. The twins were with Jessica for the afternoon. I wasn't ready for a full family reunion just yet. We sat in uncomfortable silence until, unexpectedly, my father cried. "I've been a terrible father," he said, his voice cracking, "and an even worse grandfather. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see it now, how selfish we've been." My mother reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but gesturing toward it. "We've spent months in family therapy," she explained. "It was Jessica's idea. We resisted at first, but it's been transformative." I didn't rush to forgive them or make promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I shared pictures of the twins and told them about our new life. They listened without interrupting, without making it about themselves, perhaps for the first time ever. As we parted, my father asked quietly, "Would it be possible someday to know our grandchildren?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "That depends on your actions, not your words. If you're genuinely committed to change, we can start with short supervised visits. But understand this. My children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother." Walking away from that meeting, I didn't feel the crushing weight of obligation or the burning resentment that had defined my relationship with them for so long. Instead, I felt something new, the calm assurance of a woman who knew her worth, who had created boundaries and would enforce them without apology. Whether my parents could truly change remained to be seen, but I had already transformed. I was no longer the daughter desperate for approval. I had become a mother, fierce in her protection and clear in her expectations.